Max basically kind of gave me a brief to provide a bit of context for all of this work, and also basically provide something to actually, like, I guess, give some context for this workshop that we're doing later on in the afternoon, in addition to some of this work here. I will run through these slides fairly quickly. It's online at this URL that you can see there. I'll also be available for you later on. So I don't know if people can see me or anything like that, but my background is largely working in a series of wacky environmental data startups for the last 15 years, like working out the carbon footprint of pretty much anything we can, putting APIs on that so that you can query that. We did that about 10 years ago, or directing public spending for net zero. I now work at the Green Web Foundation, which you can probably guess what we might care about if our name is the Green Web Foundation. And I work as the chair of the policy working group at the Green Software Foundation, which is a larger industry body focused with this. I also edit a magazine called Branch, which is all about the intersection between climate and technology. In the time I have with you, which should be about 10 minutes, I'm going to share a mental model to help kind of contextualize some of this discussion around efficiency and like programming, really. We're going to share a model for thinking about kind of levers for impact you have as a technologist. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about greening your stack, about a way to think about basically the dependencies in your supply chain when we build any kind of digital service these days. So let's start with consumption, intensity, and direction. This is the model that we use where I work when people basically try to understand the environmental impact of technology and what kind of place it has in the context of like a climate crisis. We talk about consumption in terms of, can I change how much we need? So this is like the amount of digital resources we might need, depending on how you might say build a service. Let's say you do something like have a phone call with a loved one, a video call with a loved one. You could require fewer digital resources if you coded it a particular way, or you could have more. You could require more. So this is kind of the main thing we're focusing on here. But that's not the only lever to actually reduce environmental impact. The other one is intensity, which is basically given a set amount of digital resources that I'm using or that have been created, can I change how much harm is created by doing that? And this is just simply the fact that most of the time, the electricity we use comes from fossil fuel sources. So there's a very clear kind of environmental impact on that. But there are also other impacts, like, say, water, for example. If you're running a data center in an area which has water stress, that's also going to be an impact. In the same way that engineers might have a performance budget to kind of deal with consumption, you'll increasingly find people having carbon budgets for digital services, because that creates an incentive to basically think about how you might be using energy from greener sources, or even changing how you program to make something more amenable to this. And a really good example of this is actually how companies like, say, Google, for example, will move significant computing loads to times when the carbon intensity of electricity is lower. If you're in France or England, there you have APIs and data feeds that you can use for this, and not just for computing. People use it to basically time when they bake cakes to make baking the cakes greener. But in Germany, you don't have this right now, but it's a thing that would be really nice to have. Finally, direction is this idea that, okay, you might have like a really, really green piece of technology and it's running on, say, really, really green energy. But what you use it for really, really matters, especially in the context of a climate crisis. You could use, say, green AI to help you, say, transition away from fossil fuels. You could use it to prolong our existence on our dependence on fossil fuels. So when we talk about it, we usually refer to it as this is kind of where you might start with this. So if you're working as an engineer, you can usually start making changes around consumption very, very quickly because it's part of your job. Generally, you won't get in trouble for asking your boss if you can reduce the amount of money people need to spend on things. Now, when it comes to things like intensity, you might be thinking about changing either a region, changing where you run computing jobs. That's a bit of a risk. Or it might be changing suppliers. Again, that could also be a risk. So it's a little bit higher, but it also has a greater degree of impact there. Finally, there's things like direction. If you were to say, we're only going to work on, say, a green project from now on, rather than, say, helping people drill for oil, for example, then that's going to have a massive impact. And I'll show you some examples of this later on. So that's the levers for impact. And that's the model we use when we talk about technology. And while we're talking about consumption here, it's useful to know and think about intensity and direction as other levers. The other thing is about greening your stack, thinking about your supply chain, because these days, when we build any kind of digital service, it's almost always comprised of a series of different tools, not just your own thing. And for the longest time, lots of the certification tools have generally assumed that you have total control over your own supply chain, which is often not really the case. You might build something at the very top of this line here, but you'll be relying on a hosting provider, someone who runs a data center for you, someone who's providing cloud compute, and basically how aligned they are with your goals should probably be some criteria that you might think about. And when we talk about this right now, if you are composing or building a digital service, you currently have this kind of somewhat awkward situation that you can only choose 3 of these good things. This is what we refer to as the green web triangle. So a lot of the time you want to have services which are convenient, so that you're not running them all yourself all the time, because that's going to take up a chunk of your time. I would ideally want to have like services from a diverse ecosystem rather than just one provider, because healthy ecosystems are diverse ecosystems. And finally, well, we're in a climate emergency, so probably shouldn't be running the energy, if we can help it, on fossil fuels, which sadly is the norm right now. And most of the time you can only pick 2, and this is why I'm sharing this with you. This is kind of how most of us tend to work. We tend to optimize for convenient and diverse, not necessarily caring about fossil fuels, fossil powered. And this is basically the default for most of us. It's not ideal, and it does ignore the fact that we literally are in a climate emergency, and you continue seeing that. If we were to focus on diverse and fossil free, this is what a lot of us tend to use, then you'll end up spending a lot of your time basically knitting your own underwear and doing lots of things which are typically done by other people rather than you. And then finally, if you just focus on convenient and fossil free, there are providers that do this stuff right now. And a lot of the hyperscalers can talk a very good game about this, but we are basically consolidating power and money with a lot of the same groups who are currently doing a really good job of helping extract oil and gas and put us into more of a mess. And in many cases, lobbying for changes make it harder to basically end up with the market conditions to incentivize the stuff we're all in this room for. So that's the Green Web Foundation. I mean, that's the Green Web Triangle. Now, if you were to talk about your supply chain, the components in this, we think there's like 3 things or 3 kind of questions you might think about that would help you in this. So first of all, one of them is about alignment. Do their values and goals match our values and goals? If you've set targets to be net zero by, say, 2030, do they have those as well? And is their behavior the same behavior that you would be expecting to? Another one is exposure, which you can see here. How much am I exposed to using these people, using these services? And influences, basically, as you can see, if I'm using something and I would like to be able to have some influence over them, ask them to maybe, can you do something different? Are they going to listen to me, or am I so small that they're not going to have any real impact on this? So here's an example. If you are using green IT, if you want to build like really kind of cool green services these days, one of the real kind of leaders is a company called Microsoft that I guess everyone has heard of here. Now, this is cool, and Microsoft are a member of the Green Software Foundation, and they are very, very much some of the real leaders here. They're also some of the leaders in extracting oil and gas right now. And when you have this, it basically means that a single project, this is actually, this graph I'm showing you here is basically taken from press releases from a single contract with Microsoft and ExxonMobil, talking about using AI to actually increase extraction of fossil fuels, which will be burned, which will then kind of put us in more of a problem. You can see that it has the same kind of, just the consequence of that, had the same environmental footprint of all of Facebook, which is why we need to talk about direction and alignment and things, as well as just actually only thinking about green IT. And I'll skip on this. Exposure is, the reason I spoke about exposure is if you were using a provider here, are there ways that I can untangle myself from this? Or am I kind of stuck with this? If I'm working with a hyperscaler, am I relying on a bunch of free computing credits for my entire business? That means that I'm not really able to have a kind of honest conversation about their goals and how they're aligned with what we might have. And there are some really good examples of this that you can choose. Mozilla did some really interesting work earlier on this year, talking about, well, we have some climate goals of our own, and we basically, they put a tweet out saying, we accept donations in all these different cryptocurrencies, one of which was extremely reliant on proof of work. And they basically also did some work with Wikipedia, and they basically they got a lot of pushback from this, and they were saying, well, how exposed are we to having things like, say, proof of work-based currencies for revenue? And they realized they don't have that much, which meant that they weren't too exposed to them, which meant it made it easier for the two of them to basically say, we're not going to accept donations in this kind of form from now on. And it's kind of gives you an idea for this. Finally, influence. If you discover practices that seem to be maybe not aligned with the things that you're trying to do you have any sway over organizations here? And the example here that I would point you to is actually the work that you see in the early 2010s with the UK government, where they did a real push for open source. They weren't necessarily pushing open source because they wanted to have just like cuddly green software or cuddly open source software. They were doing it because it was a way to actually have a way to basically promote competition between different providers and say, I have these criteria here, and I really need you to help me either reach these goals we have on climate, or these goals we have in terms of like buying from smaller providers. And when they were only working with a number of very, very large providers, they didn't have that. So they basically were able to say, well, I'm spending this much money with you. What can you do for this? Now, in many cases, if you are working with a very, very large provider and you're very, very small, you don't have that. So being able to work with a more diverse ecosystem means that it's more likely that you'll be able to get alignment on a lot of these things. So this is the idea of like a green stack. If you can find, if you're working with open source tools, and if you can find examples which are API compatible to the tools you are able to use, then yeah, you can do this. You could basically green parts of this. You can increase the alignment across your entire supply chain. You can reduce the exposure you might have to the things that you don't feel so comfortable about, or are maybe in contradiction with your own organizational goals. And finally, you can increase influence to get them to move slightly faster. And in many cases, if you're, say, a public sector actor, like a state with binding commitments around climate change, you might want to think about these kind of things when you're choosing who your suppliers might be. And if you're looking to sell to states, you might want to think about this in terms of, well, what are your goals and how do they meet with the goals that your organization actually has? So that's kind of it. These are things I want to share with you. So levers, we talk about consumption, but there are also other levers like intensity and direction that are worth being aware of. We currently have this kind of state right now where we have a kind of green web triangle where you can choose 2 of these 3 things most of the time. And it'd be good to be able to have more than that. And we probably need to kind of have a more diverse system or diverse ecosystem of providers to make that possible. And finally, if you're going to be thinking about your supply chain and how you might build a service from different providers, then it's useful to think about alignment, exposure, and influence for this. So this is it. It's online, as you see there. I'm on most social media tools as Mr. Chris Adams, and I'm reachable at chris@thegreenwebfoundation.org if you want to speak to me about any of this. And I think that takes us into lunch, everyone. So thank you so much for listening to me when your bellies were rumbling. And if any of this has been interesting to you, I am running a workshop. So we are running a workshop in one of the rooms over there after lunch, all right? Thanks, folks.